Another thing that you've written about, which is fascinating and gets a lot of news coverage, is the idea of microplastics in processed foods, or just in our diets in general. Mm-hmm. And there's this wild factoid that each person has a credit card's worth of plastic in their brain, or a spoon, plastic spoon worth in terms of mass. How do we get to the point where there's plastic in our food, and how does it potentially affect our mental health and physical health?
Yeah. So I think microplastics, as you said, are this very, not a new thing, but a very emerging interest of the public. And I think it's really a byproduct of plastics just being in everything. Mm-hmm. So from pollution being in the air, from the foods that you eat and how they're packaged, and again, alluding back to the ultra processed foods, that how they're processed, how they're packaged, all these different things. There's so many different routes that as humans, we are literally ingesting plastics that they can accumulate in your body. So over the last few years, there's been a number of papers showing how it accumulates in different organ systems, from your liver, your kidneys, even your heart, and how it's in plaques and predicting your risk of stroke. That was a trial in the New England Journal of Medicine.
So plastics actually in the plaques themselves?
In the plaques.
Wow.
Yes. And those being a predictor of adverse events beyond that as well, too.
Right.
So I think it speaks to how present it is within our bodies. And as you mentioned, a number of studies coming out quantifying the amount of plastics within our brains. And one of them came out in Nature Medicine a few months ago in this year, maybe more than a few months ago now. But it showed that there may be even a spoon's worth of plastics in the brain. So for me, this was very interesting because I thought from a mental health perspective, there's not really a lot of studies saying what's happening as a result of this. And the difficulty comes in studying that. This study that looked at plastics in people's brain was post-mortem. So it's very difficult to quantify mental health variables retroactively, post-mortem, and do all these things. So I began to wonder, how can we quantify microplastics that someone's intaking? We don't have, we have a dietary inflammatory index. You can guesstimate what someone's inflammation is based on their diet and stuff of that sort. We don't have a dietary microplastic index or anything similar to that. So I knew, based on the existing associations with ultra-processed foods, that it's associated with increased depression, anxiety, all these different things. We also know that ultra-processed foods are one of the highest things to have microplastic content. And the other thing is that in America, at least, the stat is, I think it's over 50, almost 75% of the energy intake in America comes from ultra-processed foods. So to me, that looked like a pretty good proxy to estimate microplastic content. So I had just written up a commentary on that saying exactly what I described here, that we know there's an association between ultra-processed foods and mental health in a poor association. And we also know that the ultra-processed foods have a lot of microplastics. What effect is there having on our mental health? And there's not a definitive answer. I think that was more of a call for action for observational research to say, guys, let's try to measure what effect this is having on the brain or on mental health. Because, it doesn't take a scientist to say, if you have a spoon's worth of plastic in your brain, it's probably not good for your mental health. I could be wrong, but that is, I think, a decent hypothesis. So it was more a call to action. And even the thing I alluded to before, if having a dietary microplastic index would make sense too, because it would make a lot of the observational research very useful, where if we had surveys to people and we can estimate how much microplastic content you're having, it would allow us to tie it not only to the mental health variables, but also the physical health side of things too. So yeah, it was more a call to action based on mechanisms, based on the associations that already exist and the pure amount of plastics in our brain, as a call to action. And I don't know if there's been any studies since on a mental health perspective, but I hope for them to come out in the coming years. We actually did a review that's under review right now, a systematic review, kind of looking at the health outcomes of microplastics, and none of them really looked at mental health. So despite all of the headlines, there's a lack of evidence in this space.
So there's this wild fact. I think it came from your paper, is that between 2016 in 2024, the amount of plastic in the human brain has gone up 50%. So just in that 8-year span, in the last 9 years, that's wild. 50%. What's changed in our packaging or our food processing to allow that to happen? Now, from a physiological level, how does plastic get past the blood-brain barrier?
So I think one thing is, so there's microplastics and there's nanoplastics, and I'm forgetting the exact measurement differences of these.
Right.
But we see more of the nanoplastics, so the smaller plastics that are actually getting to the brain. The brain, as we know, is lipophilic, and for some reason, the plastics like to follow that pathway, and they may end up in the brain as a result of that. There's been other interesting research. I think it was in JAMA Network Open, maybe, looking at the olfactory pathway, so to get to the brain as well too. So there's not a definitive link of how these plastics are actually getting to the brain, because we know that the blood-brain barrier is usually pretty good at this.
Yeah.
The other thing that I didn't mention in that Nature Medicine study is that they found people with dementia actually had higher amounts of plastics in their brain compared to those that didn't. So again, this is an association. It doesn't mean that microplastics cause dementia, because we know in Alzheimer's disease, the blood-brain barrier is also leakier, which would permit the inflow of more microplastics. So the arrow can go
makes sense,
both ways. So not to say microplastics cause dementia, but again, I don't think it's a crazy hypothesis to say having plastic in your brain may accelerate some of these processes, because we know that even something like Alzheimer's is there's a lot of hypothesis about clearance of waste products and the lymphatic system. And again, having plastics there to obstruct that or cause inflammation may not allow that process to happen. So I do think the arrow is bidirectional there for microplastics being higher in someone with dementia. But if there is a causative element, I think that is also very relevant to pay attention to, given what you mentioned. In the last few years, a 50% rise is not insignificant.
Oh, absolutely not. So is this something that should be on the radar of everyday people? Like, should you think twice before you consume something? Oh, this might have this amount or that amount or more or less amount of plastic. And if we should be thinking about this, what are some practical things that people can do, despite the fact that it's so pervasive? I mean, one debate or discussion that I've seen multiple times and that I've had with friends is, we should switch from beer in cans to beer in bottles. And then you read that, in fact, the bottles themselves might have more plastic in them than the cans do, which are lined with the plastic. So what can somebody do to reduce their exposure to micro and nanoplastics?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is knowing that you cannot reduce it to zero. Just with the current today's world, trying to make your goal to be zero will drive you insane. But there's a few things that you can do to just try your best to avoid intake. So we mentioned one of ultra processed foods. It's just good for your overall health, independent of microplastics, to try to avoid those as much as you can. Even other things like bottled water sometimes can be something that, it's in a bottle of plastic can be something to avoid. Even things like tea bags were associated with a lot of.
That's another one. They got a lot of news. Yep.
Yeah. So a lot of coverage for that. And then even microwaving your foods in plastic containers is a very big exposure source too. So instead, going for things like glass or different things of that sort may be safer. But again, as you said, the evidence seems to go both ways sometimes, where this is better, then a study comes out and says, well, actually, this is not the greatest. So I think right now we can only work with the best evidence that we have and try to be cognizant of avoiding different things that you can to the best of your abilities, but also having the caveat that it's almost impossible to be completely zero. So just if it's at the forefront of your mind, that's already a lot more than most people probably, and just making some of those substitutions probably go a long way. But I can't definitively say that will change any of these outcomes that they've seen in the studies, because there's actually no studies to say, if you change this or change this, what does your body microplastic content do? Because for all we know, the brain, since it has such high levels, maybe it has a preference for this. So even low levels are all going to the brain or something. Like, I don't have those numbers in terms of changing our behavioral habits and microplastic levels, but we can infer that from decreased exposure likely would lead to decreased accumulation. So yeah, the evidence, again, very sparse in terms of what exists, but these are just some practical things that people could do.
Yeah, you mentioned confounding studies, less plastic, more plastic, or, caffeine's good, caffeine's bad. Wine is good, wine is bad. But this is why it's so, what you do as a science educator and communicator is so valuable, because you help to make it more digestible and break it down. So I appreciate what you do for exactly that fact. Now, is there anything you can do? I guess my last question on microplastics, can they be removed from the body?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in animal models, I think it was in a zebrafish, actually, so not a human. We are not zebrafish. An interesting thing that we wrote in the editorial was that these zebrafish, when they were in an environment that didn't have a lot of microplastics in the water and everything, it seemed that the levels decreased, and it was over the span of weeks to months. Now, the mechanisms of how that happened, not entirely sure, but it suggests that the body was able to clear out these microplastics in some sort of way, some of our natural functions, again, which is why we place such heavy emphasis on decreasing the exposure. There's been a number of papers coming out about different blood therapies and all these different things. I think they're very preliminary. It's not definitive enough to say, hey, you should go to the clinic and get your blood swapped out with non-microplastic blood. I don't think we should be doing things like that.
Right, or dialysis.
Yeah. I think what we should instead be focusing on right now is decreasing the exposure, because another statistic in the Nature Medicine paper was that, yes, although the microplastic content increased over those years, it didn't change based on the age of the person, which means that the body, again, is able to somewhat clear it. It's not just endlessly accumulating, because you would imagine if your body couldn't clear the microplastics, someone who's 90 years old should have a lot more than someone who's 30 years old.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So
a whole plate, not just a spoon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So our body is somewhat regulating and clearing this on its own, which is why I think you get a lot better and safer outcomes likely if you're just avoiding exposure and allowing your body's normal mechanisms to clear it before we have definitive evidence of an effective clearance strategy. Because it's one thing if tomorrow we see a paper come out in Nature or Science that there's this microplastic clearance strategy that is clinically approved, safe, et cetera, then the story changes. But right now that doesn't exist. So I think, again, highlighting avoidance of exposure rather than trying to take it out per se.
Yeah. Yeah. The zebrafish example is interesting where the quantities dropped when you put them in clean water, for a lack of a better term. So maybe it's just osmosis or passive diffusion, right?
Yeah, it could be.